year 2015 is the 100th anniversary of the sinking of the Lusitania. And it was a very seminal event in many ways. It was probably the worst atrocity up to that time that had been committed in warfare in modern times against civilians. It's not to say that there were various maritime disasters that would have been on a par with it. And nevertheless, it sort of set a benchmark, it set a new benchmark on the depth to which, I suppose, barbarity would sink with regard to warfare on civilians. That was manifested later by the bombing of London, even during the First World War by the Germans from Zeppelins, and of course it culminated during the Second World War with the dreadful bombings of Hiroshima, Nagasaki and Dresden and so forth. That warfare no longer just included the military. I'll just tell you briefly about how I come to be doing this lecture. It's a little outside the scope of what I normally research and speak about, because it's a well-told tale and it's been well written about by better people than myself and well researched also. But I was actually asked to put the talk together by a teacher friend of mine who teaches in St. Patrick's School in Cunard. Apparently they have the First World War on the school curriculum now, and the Lusitania is mentioned in it, and she asked me would I put the talk together for her combined 6 classes. And we seem to have lost the picture. There we go. And it was a great joy to lecture to so many intelligent young sixth formers who asked me a lot of very awkward questions at the end. So I was simply asked to give the talk several times since then. But I normally research things that are a little bit more obscure and haven't been so well researched before. But at any rate, the Lusitania was a magnificent vessel. At the time she was built and launched, she was the biggest ship in the world and the fastest ship in the world. They were the wonder of the age. She was built in 1906, launched in 1906 and went into service in 1907. And that's a picture of her leaving Liverpool, where she was based. She was belonged to the Cunard company, famous liner company. They were built for one purpose. The principal purpose that they were built for was to carry passengers mostly across the Atlantic as fast as possible, as comfortably as possible, and as cheaply as possible. And they were very efficient in that. They competed at the time for a trophy called the Blue Ribbon. And that was awarded to the vessel that made the fastest crossing of the Atlantic. And at the time the Lusitania was launched, it was held by their competitors, the Norddeutsche Lloyd line, the Kaiser Wilhelm, the German liner called the Kaiser Wilhelm. As soon as the Lusitania went into service on its 3rd voyage, it took the Blue Ribbon from this vessel here. There were various other liner companies such as White Star Line, which the Titanic belonged to, and a couple of other German companies. Now you'll see a lot of illustrations giving you comparisons of these great liners at the time, and this is one of the great big ships upended alongside one of the first skyscrapers in New York. This is actually the Woolworth building, and it's absolutely, I've stood beside it and looked up at it, it's absolutely enormous. But you'll see a lot of this sort of thing as well, comparing the various liners to the pyramids. And it was actually at the time, outside of the Great Pyramid, one of the largest man-made objects that had ever been made. The Germans were nothing loath to get in on the same act. They showed the Sphinx also in their illustration of it. But you'll see plenty of this sort of illustration in visual stuff.
Okay.
So I went with them, we flew over. And my principal objective of going over was to visit the Maritime Museum over there. Not to go on the tear, although I did that as well.
That's a bonus.
I got up, they were all staying in bed, and I got up early and I had breakfast, and I was wandering over to the Maritime Museum, and I decided I'd have a coffee and a bun. And I went into this place that had been a bank, lovely restaurant, and I ordered a coffee and a bun. I was sitting down having it. And these 2 young girls, I'd say girls about mid-20s, came over and asked me for my autograph. And I said, oh, by all means, and they gave me something to sign on. I signed my own name on it and something in Irish, Canary and Motorlive or something like that. And
Go, do it again, do it again.
Yeah. Yeah, the thing has gone off, as you
Oh,
can
it
see.
doesn't matter because I'm
So,
filming you. That's
I
it.
didn't,
Right.
I didn't,
Not too
master
bad.
of arms.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're not
I actually
going
knew
to
one of
tomorrow.
the,
Freezing, absolutely freezing
Yes.
out there. So, we're just saying that we're going to the GIA Museum tomorrow.
year 2015 is the 100th anniversary of the sinking of the Lusitania. And it was a very seminal event in many ways. It was probably the worst atrocity up to that time that had been committed in warfare in modern times against civilians. It's not to say there were various maritime disasters that would have been on a par with it. And nevertheless, it sort of set a benchmark, it set a new benchmark on the depth to which, I suppose, barbarity would sink with regard to warfare on civilians. That was manifested later by the bombing of London, even during the First World War by the Germans from Zeppelins, and of course it culminated during the Second World War with the dreadful bombings of Hiroshima, Nagasaki and Dresden and so forth. That warfare no longer just included the military. I'll just tell you briefly about how I come to be doing this lecture. It's a little outside the scope of what I normally research and speak about, because it's a well-told tale and it's been well written about by better people than myself and well researched also. But I was actually asked to put the talk together by a teacher friend of mine who teaches in St. Patrick's School in Cunard. Apparently they have the First World War on the school curriculum now, and the Lusitania is mentioned in it, and she asked me would I put the talk together for her combined 6 classes. And we seem to have lost the picture. There we go. And it was a great joy to lecture to so many intelligent young sixth formers who asked me a lot of very awkward questions at the end. So I was simply asked to give the talk several times since then. But I normally research things that are a little bit more obscure and haven't been so well researched before. But at any rate, the Lusitania was a magnificent vessel. At the time she was built and launched, she was the biggest ship in the world and the fastest ship in the world. They were the wonder of the age. She was built in 1906, launched in 1906 and went into service in 1907. And that's a picture of her leaving Liverpool, where she was based. She was belonged to the Cunard company, famous liner company. They were built for one purpose. The principal purpose that they were built for was to carry passengers mostly across the Atlantic as fast as possible, as comfortably as possible, and as cheaply as possible. And they were very efficient in that. They competed at the time for a trophy called the Blue Ribbon, and that was awarded to the vessel that made the fastest crossing of the Atlantic. And at the time the Lusitania was launched, it was held by their competitors, the Norddeutscher Lloyd line, the Kaiser Wilhelm, the German liner called the Kaiser Wilhelm. As soon as the Lusitania went into service on its 3rd voyage, it took the Blue Ribbon from this vessel here. There were various other liner companies such as White Star Line, which the Titanic belonged to, and a couple of other German companies. Now you'll see a lot of illustrations giving you comparisons of these great liners at the time, and this is one of the great big ships upended alongside one of the first skyscrapers in New York. This is actually the Woolworth building, and it's absolutely, I've stood beside it and looked up at it, it's absolutely enormous. But you'll see a lot of this sort of thing as well, comparing the various liners to the pyramids. And it was actually at the time, outside of the Great Pyramid, one of the largest man-made objects that had ever been made. The Germans were nothing loath to get in on the same act. They showed the Sphinx also in their illustration of it. But you'll see plenty of this sort of illustration in various advertisements for the Cunard company. One of the Lusitania's funnels up the middle of Broadway, and the ship, a comparison of the size of the ship to the street. However, if you look at some of the liners that are plying the oceans today, that's a picture of the Titanic, which was bigger than the Lusitania, transposed upon, I can't remember her name now, there's something of the seas. Yeah.
Rhapsody.
Utterly, absolutely enormous vessels.
Yeah.
That's a picture of the oasis of the seas. And I'll just give you an idea, there's the Titanic down below, 47,000 tons. And the Lusitania was considerably smaller than that again. Now, she was actually built in John Brown's yard in the Tallaght, up in Glasgow, that yard there. And I've actually dry docked there on one particular ship that I was on. And at the time in the 1960s, it was a very, very old-fashioned yard, and some very old-fashioned practices were still being carried out there. They had ceased building ships at that stage, and they merely did dry docking and repairs to vessels. And one of the old guys in the yard showed me around the showed me all the machine shops, and he showed me the great big cutout that had been built. First of all, to launch the Lusitania, and then subsequently to launch the great big liners such as the Queen Mary and the Queen Elizabeth, all of which I saw during my seafaring career. It's hard to imagine that such a big ship could be launched in so tight a place. But as I said, they were the wonder of the age, and they had a magnificent turn of speed, these vessels. And if you look at the underwater lines of them, it's almost like a speedboat. She was powered by 4 great big propellers. It gave her a speed of about 26 knots, which was a very, very fast vessel for its day. Modern liners probably do about 35 to 38 knots. You could water ski behind them. But it'll just give you an idea of the beautiful shape underwater. It's almost like a speedboat. And there's another magnificent picture there. The 4 3-bladed propellers were subsequently changed to 4-bladed propellers, which gave her an even greater turn of speed. But she was powered by a very, very innovative device called a steam turbine that was invented by an Irishman. Steam turbines are simply rotor blades that get high-powered steam injected onto them, whereas the other type of vessels, like the Titanic, had piston engines. Powered by coal, the steam was generated by coal, but nevertheless they were a very, very efficient form of propulsion. And not too long after the steam turbine was invented in the early years of the century, it became the preferred method of propulsion, particularly for warships and for great liners. They were invented by this man here, an inventive genius from Bourne in County Offaly, Charles Algernon Parsons. His family were great scientists. They invented the great big telescope that's still to be seen in Bourne, some of you may have seen it. Now, at the time the Lusitania was built, she was regarded as an auxiliary armed cruiser. Now, this knowledge would have been available to the Germans, and perhaps explain one of the reasons, as I'll go into later on, as to why she was sunk. But there was provision aboard for mounting 12 of these guns. All of the great big liners with their great turn of speed that were built in Britain were subsidised by the Royal Navy, subsidised by the government, in order that during wartime that they could be taken up and converted into armed auxiliary cruisers, literally to serve as warships. When the war started, the Lusitania was taken up, but almost immediately was given back by the Royal Navy because of the prodigious amount of coal that it took. I'll be telling you a little bit about that later on. And she was simply too expensive to run. It just simply took too much coal to run her. There was provision on the deck for 12 of these guns, and it's generally believed that at the time the Lusitania was sunk that the guns were not aboard. She wasn't actually armed, even though she was classed as an armed auxiliary cruiser. But it would have been a very simple method, a very simple affair just to mount the guns, because they were only held on a series of bolts, and the mountings on the deck were just a circular emplacement there. That's a picture of her coming down the Clyde on her maiden voyage, with tugs in attendance. Just have a look at some of the dimensions. 787 feet long, 30,000, a little over 30,000 tons. Very narrow beam by comparison to the length. 4 Parsons steam turbines and 25 boilers, which gave it a speed of 25 knots. But look at the coal consumption, 900 tons of coal per day.
Wow.
And there was literally an army of people down in the stokehold
Shoveling, yeah.
feeding the boilers all day long. That's just a report about her taking the blue ribbon. To give you an idea of the type of passage that she did, this was phenomenal speed in crossing the Atlantic. 4 days, 22 hours and 53 minutes. That was literally knocked spots off the previous record. Subsequent liners would probably be doing it in just under 4 days. The likes of the Queen Mary and the Queen Elizabeth were even faster again, and literally about 3 3¾ days. But just to give you an idea what the vessels looked like, these were literally, somebody has described them as the stately homes of England afloat. They were done out to a very, very high degree of comfort and decor. You had, it's incredible to think that you had Italianate stucco plasterwork on a big vessel that was moving, but that's what you had, similar to those you'd have on classical houses. Antique type furniture, carpets that, you know, Axminster carpets that you sink up to your ankles in, and stained glass, Cuban mahogany everywhere, beautifully turned out. That's the entrance to the smoking room, and this great big, the reading room with a great big mahogany, split pedimented bookcase, probably with leather bound volumes where you could go and read if you were in the first class. And there's great emphasis on the gentlemen's smoking rooms in these. After dinner, the gentlemen would all retire to the smoking room to have their cigars and brandy. The second class wasn't very far behind that. It all depended upon how much you were prepared to pay, the degree of comfort that you got. And within each of these classes, there were various degrees also. Again, just depending right from, literally from the steerage up to the first class, there were varying degrees, depending upon how much money you were prepared to pay. But the second class fit out was probably almost as good as the first class. And coming down to the third class, then you had extreme comfort, I'd say, by comparison to what a lot of the people, the poorer people, would have been used to who were emigrating mostly. It was mostly emigrants that travelled in the steerage. But you can see that the dining room here is very, very well appointed. And the restrooms and smoking rooms that they had also. And places where you could relax and play cards and so forth. A great feature of the likes of the Lusitania was the fact that everything on board was worked by electricity. Elevators, electric light, and so forth. That will just give you an idea of what some of the cabins look like. Now, that's a third class cabin. In the third class, you could have 4 berths. You could have a cabin with 2 berths. Or you could even actually get a cabin with 1 berth in the third class, again, depending upon what you were prepared to pay. It's a pity that we can't see those photographs just gone out in colour, but this is a reconstruction of a section of one of the first class accommodations on one of the big liners, and it's absolutely magnificent. You can see mahogany and beautiful lighting everywhere. A lot of other comforts up on the deck, the various cafes out around the boat decks and so forth. And plenty of deck chairs and stuff. I actually had deck chair tickets in my possession, belonged to the Lusitania, that I picked up at an old market. But I actually gave them to the Kinsale Museum, and that's where they are now presently on display. I also got, in the same bundle, I got these lottery tickets. It was something you could enter on board ship by paying a small fee, and you could guess how long the ship was going to take them, from pilot to pilot. And whoever got nearest to it got the money, got the jackpot. But you don't tend to see a great many photographs of the crews of these vessels, particularly of the lower orders as they would have been regarded. These were the people who worked in the engine room. Now there are a couple of other photographs of the likes of the stewards and the deck officers and so forth. But you don't tend to see the poorer people. In an awful lot of walks of life in early photography, that is so. Rich people tended to photograph themselves. But this is actually the engine room gang. Shortly after the launch, when they'd had a religious service from the port chaplain. And most of those were Liverpool Irish. It was a very tough job they did down in the stokehold. But just to get a look at the menus on board, everything was at the very best, and the marvellous selections of food. That's from the date on that is 1908. And you can see there, you can literally have anything you liked for your breakfast. For your luncheon rather, you know.
What class menu is that?
Oh, sorry, yeah, that's the first class menu. I omitted to say that. Yeah, no, I'll just go through them all. Yeah, that's the breakfast there. And again, a huge lot of fare of all sorts. Eggs boiled, fried, or whatever. Again, I think you're coming into the I really should be a bit nearer to the screen because there's one I just wanted to point out. Yeah, I think that's a first class one as well. But I'll just give you an idea of the sort of selections of food that you have. But there's one in particular there.
That's second class.
Yeah. There's one in particular, that one there is a first class menu and it's dated 1914. September, the war was about a month old and already you can see, if you compare that to a previous menu, you can see a slight difference. There's a little bit of frugality scrapped in and there's not quite as big a selection of food on that menu. But the one I find most interesting of all is this one, that's the steerage menu, the third class. And you can see there, very, very fine selection of stuff. Ham and eggs, smoked herrings, jacket potatoes, the breakfast, tea, coffee, Swedish bread, roast beef. There would have been a different joint of meat on every day. Then you had tea with cold meat and literally 4 meals a day because you could have got gruel, which was soup and cheese and stuff like that for the supper. And I venture to say that that was probably better fare than most of the emigrants, poor emigrants would have been used to back home. So they were getting off to a very good dietary start to their adventures in the New World. But I mentioned that they were the wonder of the age. And this is a series of photographs of the Lusitania on her maiden voyage coming into New York. And you can see that she's created quite a stir because there's a lot of people down on the quay wall simply to see her coming in. Possibly some of them would have been awaiting their relatives coming ashore, and the decks are crowded here with people, and a lot of people out with their parasols and straw hats, and a great air of festivity around the place. Again, this is the same scene from a slightly different angle. Ship being brought around and pushed alongside the berth by the tugs. You see quite a lot of carriages, and these are the carriages waiting. It's amazing that in these series of photographs, which would have been taken in 1907, that the motor car hadn't come into it yet. Even though there were motor cars around, there's not a solitary car in any of those series of photographs. So it kind of gives you a picture of the age, still the age of the horse and cart, the horse and buggy, whatever. And that's a sort of a panoramic view. Again, it's very evocative because you can see the old here, the sailing ship, and the new, the great big new steamship coming into berth. That's just a three-dimensional view that I pick up. If you look at that for long enough, you can actually see it in 3 dimensions. It's a stereographic view of the Titanic in our berth. I picked it up somewhere for a couple of euros. Now, during the First World War, America in the early years was a neutral country. There were a huge amount of German Americans, a big German population living in America, a lot of people had emigrated, and particularly in New York and on the East Coast. This was the German ambassador to the United States, Count von Bernstorff. Now, Count von Bernstorff and this gentleman here, his spy master, Franz von Papen, literally knew everything that was going on about the Lusitania. Because he had extensive agents planted in the company and working as dockers and so forth. They knew what was going aboard the Lusitania. And as we see later on, it was the question of what actually went into the cargo of the Lusitania that has always been the great big question about her. But von Papen was ostensibly the military attaché, but he was the spy master, and he had an extensive spy network, and he literally, as I said, knew a hell of a lot was going on. Prior to the departure of the Lusitania from New York, our last fateful voyage, von Bernstorff and von Papen placed this notice in all of the newspapers beside the Cunard advertisement for the Lusitania. And if you read it there, it's a warning to passengers not to travel. And it states it in black and white. It couldn't be any more clear. Vessels flying the flag of Great Britain or any of her allies are liable to destruction in these waters, and that travellers sailing in the war zone on ships of Great Britain or her allies do so at their own risk. You can't put it any more plainly than that. As a matter of interest, it was von Bernstorff and von Papen whom Roger Casement here and John Devoy had been conspiring with to arrange for the arms shipment in the ship that subsequently became known as the Old to Ireland. the conspiracy had first taken place in the United States, and Caseman found his way from there to Germany to try and recruit people for his Irish brigade. Little more about him later on. Caseman will come into the story again. But the Lusitania left New York on the 1st of May 1915, captained by this gentleman here, Captain William Turner, a very, very experienced seaman. He had started off just as a deck boy on sailing ships and worked his way up from the deck, got all of his master's tickets and so forth. And by the time he took command of the Lusitania, he stood in for another officer who was actually sick, who had withdrawn from the voyage, and Turner took his place. He was the Commodore skipper of the Cunard company, a man of great experience. Now, it was customary for them to leave New York, head across the Atlantic and pick up the headlands on the south coast of Ireland, notably the Old Head of Kinsale, where they normally stood into the land then to take bearings, but you'd no Decker or GPS back in those days, or no direction finding, nothing like that. All of the navigation was done on a visual or a celestial basis from observation. The waters all around the British Isles at this stage had been declared a war zone, as you've seen from the notice in the papers. Been declared a war zone by the Germans. Now, it had also been declared a war zone by the Allies. So it was a two-way, a double-edged sword. And anything flying the German flag or associated with imports to Germany was liable to be sunk by Allied warships, because there was a very heavy blockade taking place of Germany. And most of the German war at sea was being prosecuted by the use of submarines. Now, waiting off the Old Head of Kinsale on the 7th, the day the Lusitania was sunk, was this gentleman here in his submarine, Captain Lieutenant Walter Schweiger, in his submarine U-20. Again, he was a very, very experienced seaman, one of the great aces of the German Navy, who had sunk quite a lot of vessels. Now, the question arises, the story of the Lusitania is literally riddled with conspiracy theories. And it's up to yourself to try and decide, because it's very, very difficult to tease out the actual truth of the matter, because there was so much propaganda and so much story twisting by both the Germans and the Allies. It's very, very difficult to believe an awful lot of what you read, an awful lot of what was published. And one of the conspiracy theories is that Schweiger was lying in wait for the Lusitania to sink her. That may or may not have been true, but subsequent interviews with some of the crew don't seem to confirm that. At any rate, with him in U-20 was this man here, a man who's the figure again in the story, the second officer, Raymond Weissbach. He was the man who actually pressed the button that fired the torpedo that sank the Lusitania. These were the type of submarines. Even though it was early in the war, Germany had developed submarines to such an extent that they far outshone virtually anything that the Allies had at that stage in terms of size and efficiency and range, the distance they could travel. They were very, very big. In fact, they differed very little from, even though they did get a bit bigger as the First War progressed, they were very, very similar to those which operated in the Second World War. And U-20, can you see it there, and the one that Weissbach subsequently commanded is also there, U-19. They were very, very similar. Now, as I said, it was customary for the Lusitania to set a course and probably arrive off the Old Head of Kinsale about 20 miles out, and then alter course towards the land to get 4-point bearings by the use of an azimuth compass, which gave them their exact position on the chart then, and would give them a good idea of when they were going to get to Liverpool, taking account of the tides and so forth. Again, the conspiracy theorists come into this very strongly now with the fact that sometimes orders were given to the liners to zigzag, and it's not known whether the Lusitania had orders to zigzag, because Captain Turner would never ever divulge the orders that he'd been given by the Admiralty. The Admiralty was in communication with all of these vessels, and he would never divulge. He was sworn to secrecy. Of course, he would have been a reserve naval officer also, as most of the merchant navy officers were. But he would never divulge whether he'd been given orders to zigzag or not. But in effect, he did actually zigzag, because when he approached the Irish coast, he turned sharply to port to head in for land to pick up the bearing. So, and effectively, that was creating one part of a zigzag. Schweiger was waiting in his submarine, had the periscope up, and could see the liner a good distance off. And according to all reports, he couldn't believe his eyes when the liner suddenly altered course and steered towards him. Had the liner continued on its course that it was on beforehand, they would never have been able to catch up with her. But in actual fact, the liner steamed right into their path. And he gave the command to fire. He had only 2 torpedoes left on board the vessel. He fired one. Whether or not he intended to fire the second one is not known. But he saw the torpedo exploding, and this is where the real mystery began. Because almost immediately after, almost simultaneously, there was a second explosion. There was a huge second explosion which blew the whole side out of the ship. And according to Schweiger's testimony, he was on the periscope. She began to sink immediately, and subsequent accounts given at various inquests and inquiries confirmed that. A huge second explosion took place, and the ship immediately began to heel over, and she began to sink. Now, she was going ahead at the time. She was making about 18 knots. She wasn't doing her customary 26 knots, because the company had actually cut back on the consumption of coal, and there was something like a 20% decrease in the boiler use. Some of the boilers were shut down. But even at that, even doing 18 knots, she would have been still relatively fast by comparison to most vessels, and probably would have been able to outrun a submarine on the surface at any rate. But the big mystery about the whole kernel of the mystery about the sinking of the Lusitania is what caused the second explosion. There are theorists that say there were munitions on board. There were certainly munitions in the form of rifle bullets and so forth, but a passenger liner wasn't supposed to be carrying high explosives. And the British authorities and the company and everyone else wholeheartedly denied that there were any explosives on board. Now, you can make up your own mind, and a lot of people have spent an awful lot of time trying to find out what caused the explosion. I have no doubt in my own mind that there was high explosives on board, because even at this stage, warfare was beginning to bog down on the Western Front. They were extremely short of filling for the artillery shells that were being used in such abundance in France, and there were huge exports of stuff like gun cotton and high explosives coming in from America in cargo ships. But even though the Lusitania wasn't supposed to be carrying stuff like that, it's generally reckoned that she was. Some people will tell you that the coal dust exploded, that aluminium powder that she had on board exploded, and other people will say that the boilers exploded. But there have been tests done which virtually confirm the fact that none of those characteristics would have been able to blow such a big hole in the side of the vessel. So I think there's very, very little doubt about it. We'll go into that a bit later on. But the vessel continued moving through the water because it would take several miles to get the way off it, and immediately the order was given to abandon ship. And it's very, very difficult to get your head around the sort of panic that would have ensued on a vessel that had been struck by a torpedo and began to sink immediately with such a huge explosion. Had it just been a case of the torpedo alone without the second explosion, she may well have taken the risk, but the chances are that she probably would have made it back to port with various watertight bulkheads and so forth, and repair crews and what have you. It would have been a very, very small affair by comparison to what actually happened. But panic ensued, and people running around looking for their children, their wives, their husbands, trying to get lifeboats into the water. And again, just as with the Titanic some years before, it was very, very difficult to launch the lifeboats. The lifeboats were hung in these sort of davits here. Now, I've actually experienced launching a wooden lifeboat from these type of davits. When I did a lifeboat ticket during my seafaring years, the lifeboat that you used in the Marine School, I went to the one in Belfast, was a small wooden version of this with the same type of davits, and part of the examination for your lifeboat ticket was you had to take charge of the launching of the lifeboat, get it into the water with your crew, the other people who were doing the tests, and get it under sail with the lug sail. And the boat we were using was only 17 feet long. There used to be one in Dunleary also, you may remember it, at the Marine School there. But it's a difficult task, and you really need people who know what they're doing. And with people running all over the place and panic ensuing, and many of the crew indeed killed, it must have been extremely difficult to try and get the boats launched. And out of all of the lifeboats on board, something like only 6 were subsequently launched on the port side. Sorry, on the starboard side. Because she took a list to starboard, that's the right-hand side. The boats on the port side became utterly useless because they were too high up, and you need the momentum of gravity to lower the boats. They just overhauled themselves with these rope falls through great big 3-fold purchase blocks. They also had some of these inflatable, collapsible lifeboats on board, but as I say, very few of them actually got launched, and this is a representation of what the scene would have looked like, with some of the boats being overloaded, and some of those that were launched actually were in a sinking condition. People jumping into the water, the vessel still ploughing ahead, people clutching onto anything literally that they could in the water. Again, this is an illustration drawn from some small sketches that were made by somebody that survived. The ship took 18 minutes to sink. From the time the torpedo struck till the time it went below the surface was only 18 minutes. And this is the sort of scene that would have presented itself to the first vessels that got out to the Lusitania after she'd sunk. Bodies afloat, some alive, some dead, some lifeboats. Fortunately, it was a calm day. There was very little wind on the day. The weather was relatively good. It was in May. I imagine, had the weather been worse, the toll would have been much greater. But the first vessel to get out to the Lusitania was this one here, the Wanderer of Peel. She was a fishing smack from Peel in the Isle of Man. And they were fishing down off the Old Head of Kinsale. And the man who was up on the deck at the helm saw the liner coming along and saw the explosion taking place. They were a couple of miles away. There was some breeze at that stage. And the skipper gave instructions to drop what they were doing and head for the Lusitania. When they got there, they picked up something like 179 survivors. And they were literally loaded down to the gunnels and brought them back in towards land, heading for Kinsale. The survivors were actually taken off by a warship that had come out and brought to Queenstown, which is now Cove. But that's the crew of the Wanderer, and there's a connection with that to the present day that I've had experience of recently, because the skipper, William Ball, he didn't actually own the vessel, he didn't own the Wanderer, and it's said that a lady that he managed to save, one of the survivors, was a wealthy American who found out that he didn't own his fishing vessel, and she had a boat built for him in the Isle of Man the following year, in 1960, which he gave to him as a present, literally for rescuing her. Now, he didn't hang on to her for very long. He was probably content in the job that he had as a hired skipper on a share basis in the vessel with his crew, and he sold on the vessel. Now, the vessel was called the Agve. Now, Agve means good luck in Manx Gaelic, and she's still in existence. She spent some of her time up in the north of Ireland after he sold her on. Spent most of the time after he owned her in Ireland. First of all in the north, and her latter days were spent in Balbriggan, simply operating as a small trawler. Now, she's been acquired recently by a good friend of mine, this man here on the left, Paddy Murphy, wonderful character, has acquired her, and he is converting her now back to a sailing, practically like a yacht, because she's built like a yacht. Paddy's a wonderful character, diver, artist, boat builder, sailor, marvellous character. Blacksmith, he's a blacksmith by trade, he can make anything. And he has her down in Galway at the moment, and he's getting her ready for relaunching next year. But you can see there she's very, very fine vessel, built like a yacht, and she's in beautiful condition. But HMS Juno was one of the few warships that was in Cove at the time, and she got up steam and proceeded out. Now again, the conspiracy theorists come in here because, for whatever reason we don't know, HMS Juno was withdrawn. She was told to head back to port by the Admiralty. She'd received a signal. Perhaps with so few warships around, they feared that she might have been sunk by the submarine. It was known that the submarines were operating in the area because they'd actually sunk, the same vessel had sunk 3 ships in the previous few days. She took some of the survivors off Skipper Ball's boat and proceeded back into Queenstown. This vessel got up steam also. She was a great big harbour tug. She headed out, picked up some survivors, took a couple of the lifeboats in tow, and picked up some bodies from the water. The same with the Clyde Shipping Company paddle tug, the Flying Fish. That was one of the vessels that got out. Subsequently then, the Flower class sloop Bluebell got up steam and was allowed to proceed out. By the time they got out, there was literally only bodies to be found. There were no more survivors. They'd all been picked up. Various other fishing boats arrived out also. The Cormac Sherry lifeboat was launched, and by the time they got the boat in the water, the wind had died down. There was no wind for them to sail out. These were propelled by oars and sails, and they actually rowed the 12 miles from Cormac Sherry out to the scene of the sinking. And again, nobody alive. They just picked up some bodies and brought them back to Kinsale. It was viewed at the time as a horrific tragedy and as a horrific atrocity committed by the Germans. And of course, the British authorities seized on it as a wonderful opportunity for propaganda, and they milked it to the last as far as portraying the beastly Hun as a murderer of women and children, etc. Captain Turner was summoned by the coroner in Kinsale to an inquest that was held on some of the bodies, and he did actually give evidence, but in answer to questions that were put to him by the coroner about the orders that he had, he clammed up and refused to answer them. He said, "You better address that to the Royal Navy." When the inquest was in progress, a representative of the British government came down into the inquest and told him not to give him any more evidence, that he was to remain silent. The people of Cove, where most of the survivors were brought into, opened their hearts and their doors to the survivors, and there was some very, very harrowing and horrific scenes of poor injured people and people who had lost everything. Naked people were given clothes and so forth. These are some of the crew. A lot of bodies were being carried through the streets. This is an American flag draped over a body. Some very, very harrowing scenes indeed. This man still has his life jacket on. People wandering about aimlessly, so forth. You can see the look of bewilderment in some of these passengers. This was a very, very tragic story. Mrs. Paul Crompton and her 6 children were all lost. They were going over to meet her husband in Britain, who was working there, and the whole family were lost. I'm not sure whether that young girl is a local or whether she's just wandering about. Been saved. These are posthumous photographs. The victims were photographed because it wasn't known who they were. There's no identification of them, and they were photographed for identification purposes. But I'm sad to say that some of them were actually used rather shamelessly for propaganda. Very, very harrowing, some of those pictures to look at. Little children photographed after death. The richest man in the world at the time, his name was Alfred Vanderbilt, was on board. It's generally reckoned that this was the richest man in the world. And he was last seen taking off his life jacket and giving it to a lady. Huge amount of well-known people, but I'll just show you a couple of them. Charles Frohman was another, a great show business impresario who put on great big shows in the likes of Broadway in London, the West End in London, put on operas and so forth. He was also seen giving his life jacket to a lady. Now, Sir Hugh Lane was on board. Now, So Hugh Lane at the time was the curator of the National Gallery in Dublin. And it was a controversy arose after his death. He was lost on the Lusitania. A controversy arose over the ownership of paintings that he had. He had left his paintings in his will to the British Gallery, and before he left on the Lusitania, he changed his mind and left them to the Municipal Gallery in Dublin, on condition that they find he had this very, very large collection. You're probably aware of the story, the Hugh Lane collection, and he wanted to have a gallery built for the city of Dublin, which was subsequently acquired, but before he was lost on the Lusitania, he simply couldn't find a place to house his paintings that he was going to bequeath to them. So in a fit of pique, he left them to the British Gallery. Before he left, he changed his mind again because this house had been acquired in Parnell Square, which now is now the Municipal Gallery. And he forgot to either sign the Codicil of his will or have it witnessed, I think. And a very acrimonious row erupted in subsequent decades with the ownership. The British wouldn't honour the terms of the will because it hadn't been witnessed. It was just standing on ceremony. But eventually a compromise was worked out where they rotate the pictures now. It's a very sensible solution to the thing. Sometimes they're shown here, and some of them are shown in Britain, and they rotate them around. But another, I'll tell you a little bit more about Hugh Lane later on. There was a great big funeral for people who had been lost in Cove, in a place called the Old Churchyard. First of all, they were brought to the Cunard yard here in Cove, where there was some inquests held. The bodies were attempted to identify them. This is some of the funerals, some of the naval personnel of the various vessels that were in Cove at the time, attending the funeral. The bodies were buried in big communal pits like this in the old church yard in Cove, and here they are being covered up by the members of the British Army. The only thing to mark that nowadays are a couple of these stones with bronze markers on them, say Lusitania, and it's dreadful to think that somebody attempted to prize those off for scrap recently and damaged them in the process. They've since been repaired. Dreadful act of vandalism. But just to give you an idea of the amount of people that were on board, total passengers 1267 and total crew 693. So 1960 people on board. It's thought there were 2 stowaways as well. But you can see it's a very, very high proportion of people who were lost in total. Nearly 1,200 out of over 1,900. Only 765 survivors. The proportionality between the passengers and survivors and the crew and survivors, strangely enough, was about the same. Generally speaking, crew members tend to survive a bit better because they would be more used to launching lifeboats, perhaps, and would be sort of, more used to being around the water and what have you. The total bodies recovered was very small by comparison to the amount of people who were lost, and bodies kept turning up around the coast for some weeks afterwards, some as far away as Wales, and some up around the west coast of Ireland, around Galway. The amount of bodies not recovered, 885. As you can see, a very, very high rate of attrition amongst the children, 94 out of 124. And the Americans aboard fared very badly. Only 11 survivors out of 139. This was a photograph that was got up. It's literally only something that was being posed at the time for propaganda purposes. Because that's not a Lusitania lifeboat. And there would not have been a boat of this type aboard with that sort of lettering on it. I still reckon that these are people posing for propaganda purposes. But the lifeboats that were brought in, they were very, very big lifeboats. They were well over 30 feet long. And there was a lot of these around when I was a young child that had been converted into cabin cruisers. And I remember in Holt there was one with the Lusitania's name still on it that had been converted into a lovely cabin cruiser. And I was actually aboard it one day with my father. The guy that owned it was a friend of his, and we were looking at the engine that was in it. It was something that had been put in. It was actually a Model T Ford engine. But there were a lot of them around at the time, those type of vessels, but they're all gone There were various riots took place in some cities, notably in Liverpool, where German people, people with German names who had lived in Britain for generations, some members of the Jewish community also. And this is a couple of photographs taken in Liverpool of a mob storming a German shop. I think Aschenfeld is the name. The police are there, they don't seem to be doing an awful lot about it. And this is a little further on, where they've actually got into the living accommodation upstairs and are throwing stuff into the street, and the police seem to be just standing there. There was one such episode in Dublin. A German, or a shop with a German sounding name, I think it was a butcher's in Mary Street or Henry Street. Somebody threw a brick through the window and was subsequently arrested. And he got 3 months in jail for his trouble. That was the only incident, such incident in Ireland as far as we know. Now, this man here is often cast as the villain of the piece when it comes to all the conspiracies and the blame culture that arose with regard to the Lusitania. Winston Churchill. He was the First Lord of the Admiralty at the time, and he was, being half American, he could see, he was a man of great vision in his own way. He could see that it probably was going to be necessary to bring the Americans into the war if they were going to subdue Germany. And he bent every effort to try and get the Americans to come in, and he's notably, reputedly rather, was heard to say that it would be a good idea if a ship carrying Americans were to be torpedoed, that perhaps that would be a spur in order to bring them in. He's often been accused of withdrawing warships, not giving a warship cover to the Lusitania as she approached. Sometimes destroyers would be waiting for the ship to escort her up to Liverpool. Sometimes the ship actually came into Queenstown to unload the mail. Conspiracy theorists will tell you that he deliberately withdrew all of this cover. I personally don't think that's the case. I think it was just a fortuitous encounter that Schweiger had with the Lusitania, even though he may have been aware of the fact that she was approaching the coast. The fact that she steamed towards him at the time. We'll never actually know, because the propagandists had a field day with this, and as I say, the truth is one of the first casualties in war, as you know. But, however, a man that Churchill had tasked with naval intelligence was this man here, Admiral Reginald Hall. He was an intelligence genius. He was the man that set up the equivalent of, or the forerunner of Bletchley Park during the Second World War. Now, you're all aware of that, yeah. The people who broke the German codes, the Enigma codes. Well, the forerunner of that was an outfit called Room 40 that was started by Admiral Hall. And it wasn't a well-known fact at the time, and indeed not for a long time afterwards, that Room 40 cracked every one of the German radio codes. Now, they were paranoid about that news getting out, so consequently the information that they got, they were able to decode every solitary German radio transmission. They also had interdicted all of the telegraph messages that were being sent through neutral countries to German legations abroad, and they interdicted all of those and decoded every one of them. They were afraid that news would get out, so consequently, as I say, they didn't always make best use of the intelligence. They didn't even tell the other various chiefs of staff what was going on. They only let the information out on a need-to-know basis, as they described it. But he was literally a propaganda genius also, because he was great at planting false propaganda and false messages for the Germans. But all of the people who worked in Room 40, or most of them at any rate, were still alive when the Second World War broke out. They volunteered, went into Bletchley Park and formed the basis of that code-breaking outfit. That's a picture of Room 40, very unprepossessing looking, nothing very elaborate about it. But they were very, very effective. And these are some of the transcriptions of the German transmissions. They transmitted in Morse, in code, and they changed the code every so often. But they were such geniuses at code cracking that I don't think there was a solitary code in the First War that wasn't cracked by them. The Germans were never aware of that throughout the whole of the conflict. These are some of the transmissions that have been translated. Some of them relate to the Lusitania. There was a Board of Trade inquiry got up in Westminster under Lord Mersey. A blame culture arose with this incident, as it does with most tragedies. You needed somebody to blame, and Churchill and the various lords of the Admiralty were very anxious to blame the captain. They didn't want the blame to fall on themselves. And it was a very, very cowardly thing to do, really, because the captain had acted impeccably throughout the whole thing. He didn't, as far as we know, disobey any orders, and he just did his job, in other words. But Lord Mersey wasn't having any of it, and he found Captain Turner to be entirely blameless, and he laid the blame on wholly on the Germans. He was the man who conducted the Titanic inquiry also previously. Captain Turner became very embittered for the way he was treated. He carried on as a seaman, as a sea captain with the Cunard company up to the time he retired. But apparently he was very, very embittered man, but he would never divulge any of the details that had transpired between him and the Admiralty as to his instructions. Luck wasn't with him, because when he went back to sea, he was subsequently torpedoed again off Cape Matapan in Greece in 1917 in a passenger cargo liner called the Ivernia. But he survived the war, and he's buried here in the family grave. 1933 he died.
Where?
These are some of the manifests of the lists of cargo from the Lusitania. This is what she was carrying. Now, there are some things on this that could be open to question. It makes no mention whatsoever of high explosives naturally. But it does mention aluminium. Now, this was aluminium powder. This is not working. The aluminium powder in the cargo, considerable amount. 95 packages. Now, that would probably have been several tons of that. But if you look at the amount of beef and butter that she was carrying, 342,000 pounds of beef and a huge amount of butter, that was consigned to the Admiralty. So, you can probably read between the lines there. You can see that there were 1,271 cases of ammunition. Now, that was rifle and machine gun ammunition. Now, they didn't explode because they're still all on the wreck of the Lusitania. Huge amounts of it scattered everywhere on the wreck.
Oh, notions. What were notions?
I have no idea. I have no notion. But again, look at here, a huge consignment of cheese. Now, that was down in the cargo hold in wooden boxes. Now, as I say, I have no doubt in my own mind. I've just made up my own mind that she was carrying high explosives. But it's up to everyone to decide for themselves. There were a number of reasons, of course, why the Germans would have sought to have her sunk, and every one of them they would have considered to be legitimate reasons, because it was a war zone. There was unrestricted submarine warfare was taking place in the first years of the war. After the Lusitania was sunk, the Germans cut back on that. There was such a furore internationally from neutral countries about the fact that Americans had been lost. They cut back on unrestricted submarine warfare, and they went back to what were known as the cruiser rules, whereby the captain supposedly was to stop a ship, look for the papers, find out what she had on board, and then let the people get away in the lifeboats. And it would be subsequently sunk either with torpedoes or with gunfire. But believe me, it was more honour than the breach than anything else. But the warning had been placed in the newspapers. The Germans knew she was an armed merchant cruiser. They also knew that armed merchant cruisers and all other allied vessels, including warships and cargo vessels, had orders to ram submarines if they saw them on the surface. And they also knew that she was, through their spoils, that she was carrying this ammunition. They knew exactly what was aboard. And now, there was millions of rounds of rifle and machine gun ammunition, and they would have seen every solitary one of those as a potential loss of a German life. My good friend, Paddy O'Sullivan, diver and engineer from Bandon in County Cork, conducted experiments on aluminium powder recently to see would it explode, and in actual fact he did manage to cause a small explosion, but even he is of the opinion that the amount of aluminium powder on board wouldn't have been sufficient to generate this huge explosion that took place. Walter Schweiger He went on to further fame in his submarine. He got a very, very mild rap on the knuckles from the German Admiralty and from the Kaiser. But in the immediate aftermath of the sinking, he was actually given that decoration that he has around his neck there, personally by the Kaiser. That's the Blue Max, the Pour le Mérite, the highest German award for military valour. So clearly he wasn't out of favour with the Kaiser. Not long after he sank the Lusitania, despite the fact that unrestricted submarine warfare had been more or less curtailed by the German authorities, he sunk the Hesperus without warning with the loss of several hundred lives, not very far from where the Lusitania sunk in 1915. You can see here, if you look at the list of vessels there, you can see the 3 vessels that were torpedoed or sunk by him in the days immediately prior to the Lusitania being sunk. You can see them there, those 3. Now they are all sunk in a small radius from where the Lusitania lies, all within the space of a few days. So that knowledge was around. The British Admiralty knew that there were submarines in the area. Why was the knowledge of that not transmitted to the Lusitania? We don't know. Was it withheld deliberately? Again, it's one of those conspiracy theories, but we never know. Schweiger remained in U-20 up to 1916, when he was heading back to base on the coast of the North Sea, and he was having an encounter with a German destroyer in very shallow water off Denmark, and the destroyer had to pull away because there was danger of her going aground, which is exactly what U-20 did shortly afterwards, near the coast of Denmark, in a place called Torsmunde. They tried to blow the submarine up before they got out of it and went ashore, but they weren't successful, and there are pieces of that still to be seen in the museum, the local museum. You can see that the locals took the conning tower off it, one of theirs, and I think there's a bell also. Various other articles belonging to U-20 are there. Schweiger went on then to command U-88, which was another famous submarine, and he sank a good many more ships before it in turn was lost. He was lost before the end of the war. His second in command, Raymond Weisbach, the man there with the cap, was the man who subsequently brought this man and his colleagues to Ireland, Roger Casement. Now, Roger Casement had actually embarked aboard U-20 with Schweiger to come to Ireland, but the ship developed engine trouble or control trouble and had to put back into port. And the task was taken over by his second in command, who was now in command of his own submarine, U-19, Walter, Raymond Weisbach. That's unusual to see a picture of Casement without the beard. There were a couple of other people put ashore with him. I can't remember their names now. They had orders to team up with the Odd, but the Odd was being shadowed by the British Navy. They knew everything that was going on. They knew all about the Odd, even though it hadn't got a radio aboard. They had intercepted all of the signals that had been made before that. That's a picture of Casement and Schweiger and more of the crew of U-19 up on the bridge, up on the conning tower. In 1966, at the 50th anniversary of the 1916 Rising, Raymond Weisbach was the honoured guest of the Irish government during the commemorations for the Rising. And this picture was taken down in Tralee, where Casement came ashore on Bannistrand. And he was interviewed by a team from the Maritime Institute that included my late colleague, Dr. John de Courcy Ireland, who could speak fluent German, although Weisbach had fairly good English. And he asked him a lot of very pertinent questions, both about the Lusitania sinking and about Roger Casement, and he answered them all very frankly, and it was all written down, and that archive is now in the Maritime Museum in Dunleary. And one of the questions Dr. John asked him was, did he fire more than once, or categorically no, they didn't have to, because the ship began to sink almost immediately. Now, I mentioned that there was a great propaganda crusade campaign carried out in the immediate aftermath. of the sinking of the Lusitania. Now, most of it was orchestrated by this man. This is my great uncle Eric Field. He was married to my father's aunt Francis Lowth. Now, he was an advertising executive that owned a big advertising firm in London when the war broke out. He was married to my father's auntie. And he was taken in by the British War Office to orchestrate, first of all, the recruitment campaign that took place to get people to join up before conscription had taken place. And he was the man that coined the phrase, "Your king and country need you," and he was the guy that invented the poster with Kitchener saying, you know, "I need you, your king and country need you." And he went on then to carry out most of the propaganda for the British War Office in all the different spheres of the war. And he capitalised on the Lusitania. After the war, he was knighted by King George V. And that's a picture of him coming out of Buckingham Palace with my Aunt Frances and my great-grandmother Mary Lowth in the background there. So by definition, my father's auntie was Lady Sheila Field. And my father was a dyed-in-the-wool, dedicated, die-hard Sinn Féiner. And believe me, he never talked about his family. he was the only one in the family that was, because they were all loyalists and Castle Catholics and so forth, and he wouldn't tell us anything at all about his family. I'd love to have known that information when he's alive. But at any rate, in addition to that, the young girl in the photograph there was his cousin Sheila, who married a very high-ranking British general, Sir Norman somebody or other, and she was Lady Sheila, whatever her name was. But Field was he was in one of these yeomanry regiments, and by the time the war was ended, he had been given the rank of brigadier general, although he never actually fought. He spent all of his time doing this propaganda. But these are some of the early posters that he invented for the British War Office. That was the very first one, with the phrase, "Your king and country need you." I often wonder, did he have any qualms of conscience about all of the young people that he would have persuaded to enlist and go away and get slaughtered on the battlefields of France and elsewhere. But you can see where posters were a very powerful medium of propaganda and communication back in the day. There was relatively few pictures even in newspapers back then. And there was no radio transmissions, no television. And people tended to look at what was on posters and to take heed of them. But a lot of the early posters to do with recruitment had also to do with the Lusitania. That one in particular there, like the Lusitania, strictly speaking, hasn't got such a lot to do with Ireland, other than the fact that it was torpedoed off the coast and there were Irish people aboard. But nevertheless, Irishmen avenged the Lusitania and joined an Irish regiment today. There's another one there with the Lusitania sinking in the background. Eric Field wrote a very fine book about the whole thing, which he published in the 1950s. I can't remember the name. I had a copy of it recently. I sent it to a cousin in Australia. And he explains the whole propaganda campaign. But you'll see hundreds and hundreds of this sort of illustration, cartoons in various publications. Now, these are not Eric Field's, but they appeared in all kinds of periodicals and papers depicting the beastly Hun drowning women and children. And you'll see literally hundreds of different ones portraying the Germans in this light. Coming up to 1917, the blockade was really starting to bite and take effect in Germany, and everything was in very short supply. And the Royal Navy were starting to get a bit of an upper hand by virtue of aid that they'd been given by the Americans. The Americans were neutral, but neutral on the side of the Allies, and they were supplying the Allies with all kinds of armaments, weapons and ships. So it was decided to resume unrestricted submarine warfare, and in no time at all of these American ships were sunk, as it was known again through their spy network that they were carrying munitions bound for the Allies in Europe. And it was one of the things, it's said that the Lusitania was one of the reasons why America entered the war, even though they didn't enter the war for 2 years afterwards. The memory of it would have been still very fresh in the mind. And it wasn't the reason why America entered the war. Neither was the fact that their ships had been torpedoed, but there were a whole lot of other factors, including the munitions manufacturers had a huge lobby in America to try and persuade the president to to declare war on Germany. But the thing that really set off America's entry into the war was this document that came from Room 40. It was a telegram that had been intercepted by Admiral Hall, and it's known as the Zimmermann telegram. This was probably the main reason why America entered the war, because what it was, it had been intercepted from a telegraph, one of these telegraph cables that had been sent from the German foreign ambassador, foreign minister Zimmermann, to the Mexican government, encouraging the Mexicans to invade America, in return for which they could take Texas, New Mexico and California back, territories that had once belonged to Mexico, and they would be given German aid and help. There had been a lot of trouble on the Mexican border and revolutions taking place at the time. And this was the straw that broke the camel's back, because almost this was given to the Americans the moment it was intercepted and decoded. And almost immediately America entered the war on the side of the Allies. And of course it tipped the scales immediately, as it did in the Second World War. Now, after the war, I've about another 5 minutes, so I hope I'm not keeping you too late.
No.
After the war, the Lusitania sort of faded from memory for a while until the 1930s, when various salvage attempts were reputedly made on it. Now, there was a great Italian salvage company called Sarima, which was owned by the man there with the beret, Commendatore Quaglia. And what they did was they went around identifying ships that had very valuable cargoes of metal aboard, stuff like zinc, nickel, copper, lead in ingots. And they went around to the last known position, dragged around, used very basic echo sounders, found the vessel, and then they'd anchor over it and try and salvage the metal. And the way they did it was by sending down a man in this sort of chamber that had illumination on it, and he could report up by radio. This is on a wire, on a crane, being lowered down to the bottom. And he'd radio back to say what was going on, and he'd direct the placement of explosives then on the sides of the vessels. Go back up, the explosives would be set off, and he'd go back down and report, and they used huge big grabs to pull out the cargoes and ingots. Now this is just a two-prong one. They had ones with big 8 and 10 point grabs on them, taking up huge big scoops of ingots. Now, the Artiglio was the name of the vessel that Sarima used, and they were salvaging a vessel that was full of copper ingots very near to the Lusitania. They didn't actually salvage anything from the Lusitania. There was nothing worthwhile on it that would have justified the effort of blowing open such a big ship. Plenty of other pickings, but word got out because of the fact that they were operating so near to where the wreck was, and they were based in Kinsale while they were doing it. They used to go in there to reprovision. That word got out that they were actually salvaging on the Lusitania, but it wasn't so. They didn't need to do that. That's the picture of a safe coming up off some vessel. It was a very effective method of salvaging. Back into the late 30s, a Scottish firm, I can't remember the name of it now, that used this vessel here, the Offer. They anchored over the Lusitania with the intention of surveying it to see could it be opened up, and they used this method here of diving, a thing called a gym suit. It's called a gym suit because it's a one atmosphere suit with articulated joints on it, and you didn't have to carry its own air supply inside in the thing. The reason it's called a gym suit, and all such vessels since have been called gym suit, because the first man to use it was called Jim Jarrett. They lowered them down to the Lusitania, which actually is in about 100 metres to the bottom. And the top of it in the early days was about 90 metres. So it's in great depth for salvaging and diving. But they didn't hang around too long. They went on to do other salvage, just like the Sarima. But then in the 1960s, the wreck was bought by this man here, John Lloyd, who was an American naval diver, a very tough individual. And he figured that he could, first of all, find out how the Lusitania sank. And he devoted all his time and his energy and his money to doing research. He compiled a huge archive of documents and information on the Lusitania, and he did about 26 dives on scuba to 90 metres back in the 1960s, an unheard of depth. When Bob Dare and myself were diving, we spoke about going beyond 30 metres with awe, did we, Bob? But it was unheard of at the time. There's nothing nowadays because people are going on these extended dives now with new equipment. But at the time, Lowth dived on his own, and he didn't actually do it. The amount of time he could actually spend on the bottom, he would literally be only hitting the wreck, looking at it for a couple of minutes, and then he'd have to come up. Because you simply hadn't got the quantity of air or the time to avoid getting the bends, decompression sickness. This was the vessel that he used. He again was based in Kinsale, and again there was all kinds of rumours that he was salvaging gold and diamonds and everything else off the Lusitania. But the man who now owns the wreck is this gentleman here. He was a partner with John Lowth early on. When John Lowth died, he bought Lowth's share of the Lusitania from his widow. Now, he's still alive. Greg Bemis, a very, very tough Texan who owns a salvage company. You might have saw those sorts of programs on the National Geographic where they go around recovering gold coins and cannon half wrecks. So he owns one of those companies. I think it's called the Neptune. But he's a very, very wealthy man, and he literally is investigating the Lusitania purely as a hobby to find out what sunk her. He doesn't believe there's any great amounts of treasure or gold or anything like that on board, but he literally wants to find out. And at 75 years of age, he went off and did a commercial diver's course and dived at the wreck of the Lusitania with some of the Irish guys who were diving it. Very, very tough individual indeed. But he was hindered every step of the way, as I'll tell you in a moment, by the Irish government. He had to take the Irish government to court to allow him to dive on his own wreck. He got this crowd here, Oceaneering, to do some salvage work on it in the 1980s. That was a typical salvage vessel with all the diving gear on the deck. And they recovered the bell, which is now in the, I think it's in the Imperial War Museum. They also recovered 3 of the 4 propellers. One of them is in the Maritime Museum in Liverpool. Another one is in a museum in Texas, where our friend comes from. And another one's reputedly melted down to make very expensive sets of golf clubs. A late friend of mine, Ernie Green, was on that expedition as a commercial diver, and he dived using saturation technique on mixed gases, and he recovered a load of these bomb fuses. Now, they were unfilled, they're just the casings off the bomb fuses, and these were a load of Kitchener spoons, souvenir spoons made in America, commemorating Lord Kitchener. Then, back in the late 80s, coming into the 90s, Dr. Robert Ballard, the man who discovered the Titanic, mounted an expedition to the Lusitania, not with the intention of taking anything off it. He didn't touch anything, he merely photographed it, and he did a great big photogrammetry campaign on it, took a lot of photographs, and this is an artist's impression based upon the photographs that his team took from these miniature submarines that he used, and from what they call ROVs, remotely operated vehicles. But you can see that the vessel is lying over on the starboard side, so there's no way in the world you're going to be able to find out how big the hole is or what's inside in it, because it's lying over on the side that was damaged. And it's actually festooned with nets, been heavily netted over the years. A British group of scuba divers mounted an expedition under this lady here, Polly Tapson, using the latest scuba equipment. Now, diving to a thing like that on scuba, to me now, it's literally like trying to climb the Eiger without a rope, without belays or pitons or whatever. It's utter lunacy, but it seems to be the thing to do nowadays, to go deeper and deeper. And despite the fact that equipment and the type of gases that are used other than air have improved greatly, I still think it's the notion of doing that sort of diving on a commercial basis or a military basis would be utterly unthinkable without massive backup on the surface with regard to medical recompression facilities. But there's plenty of divers doing that sort of diving nowadays. They did bring up some artefacts at the time, and unfortunately Polly died very tragically shortly afterwards. But this is the sort of gear now that guys, this is a friend of mine, Stewie Andrews, on the bottom here, who's a noted deep diver now. There's nothing to these guys to dive to 140, 150 metres. That's 5 times the depth that we used to dive to. No, nothing at all to them. But again, if something goes wrong down there, your history. Now, the amount of gear that you have to bring down, you have various gases to breathe at various depths, and electronically operated rebreathers and stuff like that. You can see all this type of stuff hanging out of them. But they do it nevertheless. And sometimes the visibility on some of these deep wrecks up off the north of Ireland is absolutely colossal. You think back great photographs at any rate, if nothing else. That's Greg Bemis and myself, Barney O'Rell, and Des Quigley, one of the first Irish divers to dive on the Lusitania. It was a seminar we had out in Rush on shipwrecks. Another picture of Greg there. As I say, he took the Irish government to court. I'll just tell you a little bit more about Hugh Lane. When Polly Tapson's group dived on the Lusitania, they brought back this story about Sir Hugh Lane. It's a complete, utter, absolute hoax. A Cunard, and a story that they just invented. For whatever reason, I don't know. They brought back the story that Sir Hugh Lane was carrying a whole cargo of old masters with him back from the States. Nothing at all about on the manifest. And that they were sealed into, that had been taken off their stretchers, taken out of their frames, and rolled up and put into lead tubes. And then the lead tubes were soldered. And not only that, they had actually seen these lead tubes down on board the wreck. And they put that story out, and it was swallowed hook, line and sinker by the Irish authorities, who went on to put a preservation order on the wreck under the National Monuments Act. Michael D. Higgins was the minister at the time, Minister for Arts. Now, to note a complete, utter ignorance of the art world, to assume that old masters or any paintings would be taken off their stretchers and rolled up with all the cracking and flaking of paintings you've had, taken out of their frames, and then subjected to heat by soldering them into lead tubes, notwithstanding the fact that a lead tube with anything in it at 90 metres would be squashed as flat as that. You know, and all the Irish, we have to have those. So, under the National Monuments Act, they put a special preservation order on it. There's provision for that in the Act. Anything over 100 years old is automatically a national monument. So they put a special preservation order on it. And they believe, as I said, they swallowed this story about Sir Hugh Lane and his famous old masters, hook, line and sinker. It wouldn't make any difference now because it would automatically become a national monument in this year of 2015. Some of the remaining artefacts from the Lusitania are very poignant. A lot of them have found a way into the Kinsale Museum. I'm keeping you along over the time. A child's shoe. Some of these medals are to be seen there as well. In the aftermath of the sinking, the Germans got up a commemorative medal in bronze. That was seized on again by the British as a propaganda exercise, and they reproduced the medal and distributed them in Ireland with a bronze covering on them. And you can see here on the both sides of them, on one side you have the Cunard office and death selling tickets to the passengers. And it says Geschäft über alles, which means business above all. On the other side of the medal you have all of the appurtenances of war on the deck, and it says underneath Keine Bandwehr, which means contraband. So there's still a lot of those knocking around as souvenirs. That's a wicker deck chair that's in the museum in Kinsale. Some of the ammunition that was brought up recently by a government diving team. That's just 303 ammunition. As I say, it was near the place where the explosion took place, but it doesn't actually explode. You have to fire them from you strike the thing on the bottom to get them to fire. You can see it was made in 1915. They'd be just manufactured. Various life jackets that turned up in various parts of the coast later on. Again in the Kinsale Museum. An American mailbag and a watch that was recovered by one of the divers that stopped at the time the ship sank, and a lady's garment of some sort that was recovered. Just to put the thing in context of, as I say, the barbarity that subsequently took place in warfare and wars against civilians. In the Second World War, these three ships were all torpedoed within the 1 week in the Baltic by a Russian submarine. They were German ships. Now, as the Russians were advancing westward, the Germans were pulling out of the occupied territories, and the three ships left Gdansk, excuse me, as it is now, with over 20,000 people between the three ships on board. Something like 200 people survived the sinking of the three vessels. So it puts the sinking of the Lusitania into some sort of perspective. I mean, they're all examples of the most extreme barbarism against civilians. But the Wilhelm Gustloff was a German state liner. I can't remember the name of that one now. That was the Steuben, yeah. But the one on the bottom there was a sister ship of a vessel called the Bolivar, a Norwegian ship that was wrecked on the Kish Bank off Dublin in 1947. Well, nearly 20,000 people lost. That's Audrey Lawson, the last survivor of the Lusitania, who died quite recently, but she had no recollection of it because she was just a babe in arms. And that is the last slide. It's the monument to the Lusitania in Cove. It was sculpted by the famous, or rather notorious, depending on which way you look at it, American-Irish sculptor, Jerome O'Connor. He wasn't really in favour with the church or with the Free State government. The church didn't like the shape of the angel on the top, and it wasn't put on it for a long time afterwards. He also did the crucifixion sculpture out in Dunleary, and that was lying in the yard. The church didn't like the shape of that either, but this was completed then. Seamus Murphy, famous Cork sculptor, did the stonework, and there were quite a lot of commemorations that took place recently on the 100th anniversary of it. So there we have the Lusitania, a famous ship in its own way, and a ship that gave rise to a lot of other events. Thank you very much.
So, meanwhile, that's Cormac. Are there any questions? Right, John?
Have all the state papers been released in Britain and Germany and America on the Lusitania?
Most of them have, but there's still an embargo on some of them. And in actual fact, it's a known fact that some of them have actually disappeared from the archives also.
All right, better.
So, yeah, so I'd say a lot of facts.
There's more to come.
And yeah, a lot of facts are never going to come out. I think there's a 100-year embargo on a lot of stuff, so perhaps after this year, more facts might emerge.
Was there any programme attached to the captain for having survived when so many people lost their lives?
Well, I think you could say that in general, a lot of people would have taken the view that the captain should have gone down with the ship, but personally I could see no reason for that. I mean, survival is a very strong instinct in everybody. But he did come in for a fair share of criticism. But I mean, one man being, you know, he wasn't responsible for the actions of the German submarine commander, and he literally wasn't within his power to save everybody. And he was very, very unfairly pilloried by the press. And it was literally just as a result of a propaganda campaign that were got up by the Admiralty, and probably by my great uncle Eric as well. Sorry?
I'm not absolutely certain, but the ratio of crew to survival, who died to survival, and the ratio of passengers, it looks to be very much in favour of the crew.
Well, I did the mathematics on it, and I think the proportionality is about the same. Yeah, I think it's about. It's about roughly about the same proportion. Now that wasn't always the case. In a great many cases of shipwrecks, where a lot of people were lost, you'll find that there would be a disproportionate amount of crew would survive. They'd know where to head for the lifeboats and stuff like that. They'd know how to get them into the water, and you will find that. But I found it rather strange in this case that the proportions were about the same.
Right, just a few little notices. There's a little box at the back. If you want to give a few bob to help this society. We're a voluntary society and we depend completely on your donations. Anything less than 50 quid, don't bother. The last thing is, you may have seen me wandering around with a camera attached to me, or me attached to a camera. What we do is, all these videos eventually go up on Facebook. And if you go onto Facebook and look up Tallaght Historical Society, you will see it. Now obviously they won't be there by tomorrow or next week. It'll probably be 3 months before they're up. But the past 2 years are up there on Facebook.
Some there already, are there?
Oh, some there already, yeah. There's about 15 up there already. Yeah. So, good meal, Margaret. I was slán bhile.
Thank you very much.